Hey, we're still here in Peru, Indiana, with a Miami native, and her name interpreted is, her native name is?
Cocotilanguia.
Boy, I'm glad you helped me with that. And the interpretation is?
Is butterfly.
Butterfly, because she was always moving around.
Sure.
And she would like to show us some of the ancestors that have made this world possible.
So here in our tribal council room, we have displayed different pictures memorializing some of our most influential council members that we've had over the years. This young lady here, her name was Chief Frances Dunnigan. Chief Frances Dunnigan was our first female chief that the tribe has ever had in its entire history. She was chief for just a very short time before she became ill. But she was very influential in the years before she was tribal chief and leading up to that. I believe she sat on tribal council with my grandmother for over 30 years, at least. And I might be, estimating that on the lower end. Some of the rest of the council members that we have, David Marks, he was the vice chief for probably at least 40 years. And he sat on the council for at least that long. Phyllis Miley, she was a very influential council member, one of the officers of the tribe, being tribal treasurer, and she sat on council for at least 40 years.
And this is a buckskin gown, right?
It sure is. Story behind that, when she was growing up, it wasn't popular to be native in the area. And so sometimes in going to school and different things, either her and my grandmother both had stories about cousins not talking to them because they couldn't. I mean, they'd get in trouble. Kids would make fun of them at school. Her dad would always call her the princess, and he had that dress, I do believe either she did or he did, specifically made for her. Now, we didn't have princesses. There was no Miami princess, but she was her dad's princess, and that's why her name was Princess. And that's why, she had a very close relationship with her dad and that name, so we miss Jeannie. This was my father. His name was Rex Siders, Lenipichez, which means spirit panther. And he was the sergeant of arms back in the 60s and 70s, I do believe, for the tribal council, and then became a tribal council member shortly thereafter. He would always tag along with my grandma at different functions and tribal council meetings and things. So, and then Mrs. Hay, which was Louise Hay, was a very good friend of my grandmother. In fact, her and my grandmother started our elder women's group. And she was a very influential Godfrey clan mother, and was sat on the council probably as long as my grandmother did, or close to it. And then Clyde Hazlett, he was one of the last council members that we had lost. Now, he didn't necessarily sit on council for very long, but during his time sitting on council, he accomplished many great things. Taught himself how to finger weave. He was one of the elders on the men's council, and he actually traveled to most of the Indiana counties getting proclamations stating that the Miami had a sovereign and government-to-government relationship with those counties and those cities. And a lot of those proclamations actually are available online, but we have them in print in the back room as well.
Okay.
So that was one of the things that he, really did to kind of help us. This is my grandmother. Her name was Laura Mark Siders. Her native name was Monqua, which is loon. She was the tribal secretary for over 50 years. She was a tribal historian and a very, very influential leader throughout the 50s and so on and so forth. Her mother was one of our spiritual leaders. Her sister, actually, her sister was 19 years older than her, but she was a tribal secretary before my grandmother. And so the position that I hold has actually been held by two other members of my family, my great aunt and then my grandmother.
Can you stand a little closer? Because between the two of you can really see the resemblance. Mm-hmm. In fact, scary enough, if you look into this picture, you might see Sarah in the future.
Maybe, yeah. Francis Shoemaker. Now, Francis Shoemaker was one of the most influential members and chiefs of the Miami Nation in our modern history especially. He was the chief for at least 60 years that I know of. He was a very young man when he became chief, and he was very involved in not only Miami, what we refer to as Miami politics, but in the cultural side, in some of the traditions and cultures that we still have today. His grandson, Scott, is actually the curator at Idle George Museum now. He is very involved in the tribe, too. He is the chairman of our language committee that myself and our current vice chief's daughter sits on, Erin Oliver. She's also a council member. But he's very instrumental in a lot of the programs and a lot of the things that we have today, even in the building.
Now, I've been doing mostly so far Eastern natives, and I'm just starting to see the headdress, but I realized from the signs in the hallway of your museum that the headdress was adopted over a period. It's not the traditional 1,000-year-old.
Correct. And
Real briefly,
yeah. So the reason that is, back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, people in this area, we have what's called the Francis Slocum story, and it's our specific story of a white captive. And so our ancestors would put on a pageant that displayed the story of Francis Slocum. But the people in the area didn't want to see our regalia. They wanted to see the TV Indians, you know.
Stereotype.
Yeah, so throughout the years, we have what's called the pageant years, which includes leather regalia and headdresses. It isn't necessarily something traditional to the Miami tribe, but our people were very poor back then, and anything they could do to raise money, they did. And so that's where some of the headdresses come from. And so keep in mind, it may have been an era where we were adopting some other, traditions and cultures, to display in this area, but doesn't mean that we lost any of ours, And in fact, now we refer to that, like I said, as the pageant era, and so we have a lot of regalia that is from the pageant era of the Miami.
We'll get a chance to show you some of the 1,000-year-old traditional headdress and costumes. And you get to Central Indiana, this is a must-see. Now, this is their council room, but there's all kinds of artifacts. And we'll move on down, but you've got to stop and see this if you're at all interested in Native America.
Now, that is Chief Ray White. And Chief White was the chief right after Francis Shoemaker. And he was the last traditionally selected chief. We had what's called the passing of the feather ceremony. And Chief Francis Shoemaker passed the title on to Chief White. At that time, we had a big ceremony, and they passed the feather. That is the last time in the Miami of Indiana tribe that we have ever had a traditionally elected chief.
Wow.
And then the last gentleman, that is Wapshing. He is our current spiritual leader. And he has been our spiritual leader, I believe, for at least, I'm 35 years, if not longer, for as long as I've been around at least. His mother, he was raised in the Netherlands, and all of the traditions and all of the cultures and traditions that his mother taught him were our traditions and cultures. And so he connected with my grandmother sometime back in the 80s, but he was a very good friend of Chief Monganza, who was a chief of the Mishingo Mesha Band of Miami. And I believe that's how he was introduced to my grandmother. But he was very, very active in Miami cultures and traditions, I believe, going back to maybe the 60s and early 70s. It could be farther than that. I'm just not, I'm not sure with Miami.
Now, these are your big tribal drums, but I'm not sure we're allowed to touch them.
I'm not. So these are our tribal drums. Our tribal drums we refer to as the heartbeat of our nation. They're what we refer to as our grandmothers. They're the heartbeats of our nation. It's the center of our culture and tradition. In our culture and tradition, only men play the drum. Men play the drum for a lot of reasons, but mainly for two reasons. So the women can dance, because the women have been doing everything else. So that's something that we kind of consider as our leisure time. We get to dance, and the guys have to play for us.
Now, this is the first time I've ever actually heard of this, although I guess I wasn't paying attention to all the drumming circles I've been to. But as I showed you the Cherokee drumming circle, there were women that were in it, and you were surprised.
I was surprised.
Yeah, and I have a large kettle drum that we play, I travel too much, so we don't get a chance to learn with it. But those Cherokee ones you saw are weekly sessions of teaching you the songs and the beats and whatever. So it's interesting. Each culture, as you pass, have a different tradition.
Definitely.
And you told me that women can only touch this drum.
The only time that it's not okay, but it's okay for a woman to touch the drum is if she feels like the drum is being disrespected by the gentlemen who are taking care of her. If the drum is left unattended, she should always be watched, always be attended. And if something should happen and the drum would be left unattended, or something with bad feeling should enter the drum circle, a woman is allowed to protect her. And then certain cultures and things and ceremonies have to be done in order for that drum to be made right again. Because she has to
Okay.
be made whole.
All right, we're going to pause here for a minute. More film at 11.